Welcome to all of you who are watching this interview with David Whitwell. My name is Michael Haithcock, and I'm currently Director of Bands at the University of Michigan and had the privilege of being the president of CBDNA from 2001 to 2003. Our guest has a long and distinguished career. His portfolio of scholarly, musical, and philosophical input to our profession is vast and too lengthy to discuss in this setting. The purpose of this interview is to get David Whitwell's experience as a leader in CBDNA so that we are creating an oral history project of past leaders, which may guide us into the future. So thank you, David, for being part of this. And I look forward to the conversation that we'll have going forward. So I know that you taught at the University of Montana and you taught at Cal State Northridge for many years. Can you discuss a little bit of your CBDNA experience and perspectives prior to becoming involved in leadership?
Yes, I was first elected vice president of the Northwest Division. At that time, the Northwest Division was independent. Today, it's combined with Western. And at a conference somewhere in 1963, they elected officers. I can't remember who was elected president, but I was elected vice president because no one was interested. There were no duties of any kind. And then 1 month later, whoever was the president left the profession, and unexpectedly. And so suddenly I had a 2-year term as president of the Northwest Division. In the meantime, I spoke, was invited to speak at a couple of other divisions. I recall speaking at Eastman once for the Eastern Division of CBDNA, and also at Pullman, Washington for one of our meetings there. My wind ensemble also performed at 2 national conventions. The first one was at Ann Arbor in 1967, which was the 25th anniversary of the CBDNA. And they held the conference in Ann Arbor in honor of Bill Ravelli, who was the founder of CBDNA. And this was, being the 25th anniversary, this was a very big event. And all the battleships appeared. University of Minnesota, Ohio State, Michigan State, one smaller band from Iowa, and Ravelli invited me to bring my band. And of course, no one knew anything about my group or me or Montana, but we made apparently a very big impression there, partly because we did an entire program of original works, nearly all of whom were unknown to any of the members. We did the Havana Symphony No. 7, which I don't think anybody knew at that time. I had commissioned a piece by the most prominent composer in Brazil, Roberto Camargo. He wrote a 3-movement piece. So the repertoire was very interesting. And I had designed marching band uniforms that were basically like a white tie and tails with an overlay with a big picture of a grizzly bear. And so we could take that off and we looked like, everybody looked like they were wearing white tie and tails. So the visual impression was nice, and the interest in the music was very strong. And as my custom, I did the whole concert without scores. So altogether, it made quite an impression. And for the next 40 years, people would come up and comment that they remembered the performance. And so it was quite a nice occasion, and certainly introduced me to the profession. And then there was a national conference in Arizona, in Tempe, in I think 72, and we performed there a brand new piece by Husa, the apotheosis of this earth. And so between those 3 things, I was fairly recognized name, I guess, by the time that I was elected to a national office. And that was a very interesting thing in itself. It was a conference in University of Illinois, and the election was part of just a normal business meeting, the kind of meeting that you don't expect anything interesting to happen. And suddenly someone announced, now we're going to have an election for president-elect. And there was no information beforehand. No list of candidates was circulated, no backgrounds of candidates. It just suddenly it was an announcement. And the two candidates were myself and Don Marcoulier, who longtime member from Drake University. And then they proceeded to hand out little pieces of paper and told everybody just to write either my name or Marcoulier and hand them in, and that's the one who would count them. Well, as you can imagine, probably a large number of people were rather intimidated to try and spell Marcoulier. So a lot of them just made a big capital M. But of course, a capital M turned upside is a W. And so one of my friends happened to be counting the ballots, and I never knew the numerical result of it. But a number of my friends made the assumption that I probably got a lot of M's turned upside down too, because Marcoulier had been a long-time member and certainly deserved it more than myself. And
That's
then,
very interesting. You know, it shows that things are much more sophisticated these days.
more bureaucratic. And then they said, we'll announce the winner tonight at the banquet, the total typical one banquet that they always have. And so at the banquet, they announced my name, and I was surprised I was a candidate. No one had alerted me. And of course, I was even more surprised that I was elected. And I was expected to say something extemporaneously, and I just, I don't remember what I said, but it was something, I'm sure, not to sound too progressive. But it was a big turning point for the organization in terms of generation. And the older generation, I should probably talk about that just a little, because there was a great deal of fear from my being elected. First of all, the older people called themselves directors. Nobody called themselves a conductor. And the name of the organization is band directors. And it's reflected in part the emphasis on the ensemble itself. The whole focus of the job was of a director of bands was the management of the organization. No one ever talked about the musical part. And this is still true today. The MENC journal every month comes out. There is never an article about music. There are only articles about how to organize an ensemble, where to put the chairs, sources of materials. But there's year after year, there's never an article that says anything analyzing a piece of music or talking about a piece of music, even though music is in the title of the magazine. Also, there was a great military background to college bands. This came from, the Sousa period, who wore military type uniforms, and that in turn came from European civic bands who still wore military type uniforms. The origin of all of this was from the period of the Napoleonic Wars. And so the whole business of marching band in the universities in the United States came from the military, from the ROTC program. And for many years, the ROTC had their own band that did halftime programs, and then, rather than the university band. And conductors wore military style uniforms. Before myself, I don't ever remember seeing a college conductor who wore a tuxedo of any kind. It was very much military feeling. In the University of Illinois, the whole program was designed like a military company. The uniform room where they kept uniforms had a sign that said quartermaster. And it was just, strictly military. And a number of universities, the band was not even in the music department. And still today, there are still, Harvard, the band is outside the department. Columbia was outside the department. Berkeley, even the orchestra at Berkeley, University of California, only became part of the music department just a few years ago. And so the background was something quite different from the idea of a musician making music with a college ensemble. And of course, they knew that I was not part of that. I had a profile that was quite different. And one or two more comments. The main concern with the college CBDNA at that time and before was standard instrumentation. At every conference, they talked endlessly and debated trying to figure out a standard instrumentation so that when somebody said band, you know what that meant. And they said, like the orchestra, when you say orchestra, everybody knows what that means, even though that's not quite true. And there was a tremendous upheaval to all of this in the 1950s, when Fennell started producing recordings for Mercury. And the recordings it's hard to describe the impact they had. First of all, due to Kilburn Hall, which I've done some concerts there myself, it's a really magical stage where somehow you hear clearly every individual part, and the overall part is dark. And I mean, a recording made there just sounds great, And Mercury, who was making the recordings, was a major recording studio. And so suddenly these recordings started coming out. And of course, this was something completely outside this military band environment. And people were afraid to death of Fennell, even though he was a past president of CBDNA. I remember when I was a student at Michigan, when these recordings started coming out, and my horn teacher there, Clyde Carpenter, had been in the original wind ensemble at Eastman. And so he would secretly invite the horn players to come to his house and have a party. And he would play one of these recordings. And then he would always warn us, now you have to promise, don't tell anybody that I did this, that I played this recording. And because it was really illegal on the Ann Arbor campus. You never heard anybody mention Fennell or the Eastman Wind Ensemble, and certainly Ravelli never mentioned it. And so it was like a secret thing, and we were cautioned, as I said, not to ever mention this to anybody. So I come along for this election, and of course my profile was something completely different than the normal past presidents. For one thing, by the time of this election, the election was in 1973. By the time of that election, I had already published over 90 articles in the Instrumentalist, mostly, and they were all focused on literature, original literature. And those articles in the Instrumentalists were then republished in a little book, also before this election, called A New History of Wind Music. And it was just glued together copies of the article. But the book was widely talked about. It was just a surprise to me. I thought it was just something the Instrumentalist magazine was doing to earn more money. But some of these articles that were really discussed quite a bit. The first one, 1964, was all about conducting without a score, which of course was new and probably not much interesting to many of the people. Then there was an article in the MENC Journal called "Can the College Band Escape Its Heritage?" And this is where the fear of me started, because just that title meant that whatever this heritage was, I was looking somewhere else. And there was one article called in MBNC Journal called "Three Crises in Band Literature" that was much discussed. I had found basically it was a period of World War I, period of World War II, and I can't remember what the third one was, where composers had a sudden, genuine interest on their own of writing band pieces, probably because of the association with the war. But the wind conductors weren't interested. These composers were making all these statements, you know, we'd like to, no one ever asked them to write a piece. They were just, again, it was outside of the perspective of the normal conductors. And then there were two articles that were also reprinted in this little book that I mentioned on aesthetics. And the point I was trying to make in those articles, and I think I made it pretty clear, was that if your world is normal band music, Sousa, Fillmore, and it means that the original wind music of Strauss and Dvorak is on the periphery. But if your concept of the wind ensemble is Strauss and Dvorak, then Sousa is on the periphery. And this seemed like a perfectly obvious aesthetic analysis to me, based on what I was doing. But that really, more than anything I ever wrote, I think that article on aesthetics really started people to think about this really is something different, you know. And I went on later on to make statements like if you have a whole concert of Hindemith's symphony and Schoenberg and modern pieces, and then you play a Sousa march as an encore, you've ruined the evening aesthetically, because the march at the end serves as a kind of electronic eraser and erases the memory of everything before that, because the audience walks out of the hall and the march is the thing that's foremost in their memory. And I was always making comments like, there's nothing important about a symphony orchestra. What's important is the music they play. And of course, by extension, there's nothing important about bands. It's the music that they play that's important. And of course, that was beyond being striking. It was like a heretic or something, you know, making a comment like that. But I was always, the core of my thinking was always in aesthetics, in particular, the difference between aesthetic music and entertainment music. And there's really no middle ground, you know. You really have to, in terms of what the audience goes home with, the experience they go home with, it really inevitably is one or the other, pretty much.
So you were elected president-elect at the ripe old age of 38 in 1973. So and all these things that you're talking about, both in terms of the scholarly writing and the performances, you were doing at a very young age, which is remarkable in and of itself.
All before.
It also clarifies in your telling some of the reasons that the fight over standard instrumentation was so severe. Because if you standardize the instrumentation, then you put certain pieces on the back burner.
Yeah.
Is that an accurate assessment?
And that, of course, partly the roots of that thinking partly laid in the brief period of national contests, I think in the 1930s. It's where Ravelli made his reputation. They had a rule in those national contests of a specific instrumentation, and it included a contrabass clarinet. Well, I knew one of the active members from California, a man named Massini, who didn't use a contra clarinet, didn't have a player, but he simply had a student walk on and sit on the stage and hold the instrument. And that counted, even if nobody played it. The fact that it was seen on the stage satisfied the requirement of the instrumentation. Well, all of this is to try and explain that there was a lot of concern about me being president, because all of these ideas were, however natural to me, being my age and my own interests, for a conductor who was in his 50s or something, this sounded like, you know, just a revolution of some kind almost. And at this banquet, when they announced that, you know, I won, of course, there were some younger members there who were all excited and came up and congratulated me. And then Mark Hinesley came up after the banquet. He was director of bands at University of Illinois. And he was one of the people that was concerned. He was a past president. And he comes up and to shake my hand, and he was crying. And he says, "Please don't destroy the CBDNA." And it was a very touching thing, you know, because that's the first time I even thought about this separation of generations or any of the things I've been talking about. But it was so clearly a heartfelt concern that I realized that I was almost out of place. And so that's the background of the election. And I guess that's about all I want to say on that subject.
Can we deviate just a minute to talk about the wind ensemble conferences that grew out of this rift, if I can use that word, between the traditional band as it was perceived at that point and then this younger generation? I started graduate school in '77, and by that time, the wind ensemble conferences were just about over. So what's the timeline of those conferences around your election, and how did that play into these concerns that the generation was expressing?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that. When I was invited at Montana to come to play in Ann Arbor in 1967, Bill Ravelli on the telephone made a very strong restriction that I had to call my group a band. This is a band organization, and it's part of their worry about the oncoming wind ensemble. And there was no problem for me. And then when I organized I'll mention in a moment, I organized the 1975 National Conference because the current president had become quite ill. And again, I ran into the board of directors, I ran into this concern that they didn't want anybody playing unless the group was called a band. And even if you had a wind ensemble, you had to change the name for the program. And I remember there were a couple of groups on the West Coast that called themselves Wind Orchestra, primarily USC. And I had a friend who called his group Wind Symphony. And for a while, I used the term Wind Orchestra in California just because other people were using it. And I found, when I first went there, I found that the term wind ensemble was misunderstood by the audience. They thought it was going to be a chamber group, you know. And so for a year or two, I called my group Wind Orchestra. So this friend who had a wind symphony criticized me. He said, "That's pretentious." And yet he used the term wind symphony. And I never did understand what the distinction between the, you know, one was okay and one was a bad mark of some kind. But then when I also organized the 1977 National Conference and could do whatever I wanted, then I invited the Eastman Wind Ensemble to come and perform because it was their 25th anniversary. And I realized that nobody was going to criticize honoring them for their 25th anniversary and make them change their name. So that was the first time a group not called band performed at a national conference. And I don't think it's a problem anymore. I don't think it was ever a problem. I don't think, again, my emphasis was always the music, not the instrumentation, not the name of the group. That all seems less important to me than what you give the students and the audience in terms of the value of the music itself. But I think finally, the name of the group, and it's part of the focus on the ensemble. You know, the focus on the ensemble was important, not the music. And so part of that was preserving the name. And but I think that's now behind us.
So in the history of these few wind ensemble conferences that were held, as you took in that style of conference, which was, to my recollection, more musically focused, and you began to plan these CBDNA conferences, yeah, how did one affect the other to the point that the wind ensemble conferences gradually ceased to exist?
Well, I think it was probably just about this time you were starting to get a whole new generation of young conductors. Bob Reynolds was my age, and of course Frank Battisti. Both of them became later presidents. Frank Battisti was a whole different. He wasn't no longer part of the band psychology, and so I think one of the things I wanted to do was to these meetings used to always mostly be in Chicago. And the CBDNA meeting was a one-day tacked on the end of Midwest Conference. You'd stay one more day, and of course nothing happened. It was a day of maybe a business meeting and meet people. There were never, I don't remember ever a performance at a CBDNA conference when it was tacked on to MENC, because there'd been a lot of performance. Midwest. There'd been a lot of performances in the Midwest 3 or 4 days. And so I put the first one on the West Coast in Berkeley, and then the next one in East Coast in Maryland. And I think that started to attract people who didn't normally go to Chicago. And even if they did, they were not part of this the old Chicago history was, kind of a thing of itself, And so when you start to have these conferences in other places, it helps enroll new people who, and they tend to be younger people. So I don't think I would, it just seemed to me that what you're asking about was just kind of a natural process that having to do with time and changing interests and more serious conductors, more conductors who are actually thinking about the music, and that's a great step forward.
Would you say that with all the various names that you mentioned, wind ensemble, wind orchestra, wind symphony, we still call the top group at Michigan the symphony band because it has a legacy, that it's really not important what you call it, it's what you do with it? Is that, you think, the primary emphasis? I think is what I've been talking about. Although at Michigan, I think Bill Ravelli, in using the name symphonic band, I think part of him was still thinking of kind of like an orchestra conductor. I'm sure you've probably seen the picture in college of Bill sitting there with his violin. And you look at that picture and you see a university student, a violin major, who looks like a normal string college student. I don't know how he got into his first job as a band director. May have been because it was a more dependable income, whereas orchestras were never full-time, full year. Even when I was associated with Ormandy, there was no summers. It started in September and ended in June. There were year-long jobs, and it must have certainly been true in the 1920s. So rather than being a jobber violinist or something, even if he was a member of the Chicago Symphony, it was probably a pretty short season. And Bill was at an age where he was ready to get married, and it may have been just he saw this job offer in Indiana as just being really a full-time job or something. But I think in his mind,
I've often thought that that I think he would have made a really good symphonic conductor. It just so I think his choice of that word was somewhat subliminal in a way. I should also say that when my preference when I first started for wind orchestra was because all the European groups were called Blas Orchestra, and none of them were called Blasmusik. Blasmusik was the group that stands on the street corner of 6 instruments, but Blas Orchestra is still used in Europe as the meaning a large concert wind group. So to me, it seemed very natural, but it's still fairly controversial. I think most relatively few groups are called wind symphony or wind orchestra, and they tend to be groups with conductors who are just, really serious about the music part, I think. So anyway,
the title of the group, the name of the group is not a factor for participating in CBDNA anymore.
No, I don't think so. I hope.
You mentioned in our exchange before this interview that the office of Vice President of CBDNA really did not exist when you were elected to President-elect. Other than your performances and your writing, it seems from what you've relayed that you had no preparation for leadership. You just kind of woke up one day and there you were elected. Is that true?
Well, I think it was designed that way. That the title was, there was a title Vice President, but not a single duty. And I think the idea was to give somebody 2 years to watch what the current president does, namely recruiting, organizing a conference. And I think, there were very few assumed duties even for the new president. That's why one of the things I did was I wrote a little manual for officers of CBDNA. And I was particularly thinking of divisional officers. In a division, somebody is elected president and they have no idea, what they're supposed to do. And so this manual went step by step, how to organize a conference, how to, just a whole list of things that you could just take that manual and start to work. And some people found that very helpful. The manual is, I don't even have a copy, and I haven't seen a copy in a long time, but it was always a fond little project for me because I wrote it on the banks of the Seine River in Paris. I was over there doing some research, and there was a day when the library was closed, and I was in no mood to run around a whole day sightseeing. And so this thing had been on my mind. So the Seine River has these nice walking areas and benches for lovers to, promenade. So I just sat there by the river and with a notebook and started writing this thing. And so it was something I enjoyed very much.
Well, I think that manual was the genesis of a very helpful structure. By the time I took over as president many years after you, there was a very clear structure of both being vice president with portfolio and then moving up to president-elect and president, feeling a sense that you knew what it was you were supposed to do. So we are all indebted to you for that.
It was obviously a helpful thing. It's like if you don't really know what you're supposed to do, and then there's going to be any planning, and everything just sort of comes, And so good. Well, I'm glad it's had some impact.
I would also, like to discuss with you the physical state of CBDNA when you took over. I was a graduate student at Baylor University starting in 1976, and Richard Floyd took over as Secretary Treasurer in the summer of 1977. And I remember the records of the organization arrived in his office in 3 shoeboxes, and we both were floored. But in our preliminary conversation, you indicated it was worse than that. So Can you talk a little bit about the state of affairs that you inherited?
One of the things that's always been personally curious to me is that the majority of college band directors do not participate in these organizations. I just saw a statistic recently that the current membership of CBDNA is less than 700. And there are probably 2,000 colleges that have some kind of a band program. And the same thing with WASB. WASB has never been 1,000, although every 2 years it's a different 1,000. People will join to go to a conference because they want to go to Scotland or something. They go to the conference, but then they don't re-enlist. And so it's never most of the people. And I always thought just it'd be a natural interest if you were a college band director that you would want to be part of this, and particularly from the standpoint of repertoire. It is when I first joined CBDNA, they had published some lists of repertoire that were really helpful. You know, I mean, you can't just go to a music store and have a drawer of interesting pieces anywhere, you know. So, but that's the fact. It's just not most people, and it's apparently still that way today. So, I've forgotten your question exactly.
The question was related to the financial stability of the organization as you inherited it.
In my case, the 1975 conference, which I had to organize mostly because the current president became just unable to do it. He had contacted the site, a very expensive motel on the bay of San Francisco in Berkeley, and he had invited bands to play. But that was about it. He had done no planning for the sessions, or, you know, what do you do for 3 days? And so when I started looking at some former conference programs and so forth, I discovered that this Society of Conductors, that there had never been a conducting clinic. So that's the first thing I thought of, and I organized 4 conducting clinics. 2 of them, I picked the two of the most prominent current conductors, college conductors, John Painter at Northwestern and Fred Ebbs at Indiana. They were both very active doing all-state bands and things. And I told them, I'd like to have you, I'll give you a good high school band, and the repertoire will be the first whole suite, which any good high school band would not have technical problem. And what I'd like for you to do is just to pretend like this is your first rehearsal with an all-state band or something. Let us see what you do at the first meeting with a group. I thought would be a really interesting thing, you know. It's a little bit like having a manual of what to do, you know. But these 2 prominent conductors, very experienced conductors, were afraid to do this. They both said, I will only do this if I first have a secret 2-hour rehearsal with the group. And of course, that ruined the whole concept as far as I was concerned. I wasn't sure it was still interesting to watch, but I really wanted to know what they did. I remember one time I was doing a clinic in University of Eastern Kentucky, and in an adjacent town, Clarence Sawhill was working with an all-state band for Kentucky. And I had somehow an afternoon off or something, and I drove over to watch what he did in his first rehearsal. He was a very famous conductor. He spent an hour going around the band, tuning individuals, but also giving them secret information. Here's a secret fingering on flute. Here's a secret fingering on clarinet. Oh, it took an hour. And of course, those kids, they were just there to play, you know. And it was a really deadly thing to sit there with your instrument for an hour and not play a note. And so that was, I wanted to see what these other guys did at their first rehearsal. You know, I think Sawhill's case, he felt he needed to impress them with his ability or his knowledge or something. But it was pretty deadly from the viewpoint of a 17-year-old kid or something. Then when those were two sort of demonstration clinics, conducting clinics. Then I had two that were talking clinics. I asked Bob Reynolds to, he was always been very strong in the idea of analyzing chords and everything. So he had presented something somewhere I saw using George Washington Bridge of William Schumann. So I asked him to do that again, and he did a very interesting job of talking about the chords. And then I asked Ravelli to talk about whatever he felt was an influence of his Italian background. And he picked the title Portamento. And it was really interesting. I remember one thing in particular that I always used. He said, if you have a student who's playing a solo part and has a slur of, you know, more than an octave or something, for the student, it's always kind of a scary thing, you know, am I going to hit the note, hit the top of the slur? And Bill said, if you have them just do the slur, but then tongue the upper note, the audience will never hear that it was tongued, but it will always be accurate pitch. The student will just have all the courage he needs to. And it worked. I mean, it was an amazing trick, you know. So he spoke an hour about things like that, and also in terms of his melodic ideas. It was a really valuable clinic, and I'm sure no one had ever invited him anywhere just to talk. You know? And
so you're basically you're saying that these types of clinics were previously foreign concepts to a CBDNA conference?
they had never existed. Yeah, and it struck me as odd because to me, this is a group of conductors. And you go, if you're a young conductor, you go thinking, well, I'm going to hear all kinds of great stuff. You'll hear probably some great music and some repertoire, but mostly you heard arguments about instrumentation. And there was also still some arguments about how do we get college credit for the band. Not everybody had been able to do that. It was a very kind of functional organizational conference, not very inspiring, you know, in terms of music, but I'm sure it had its place. So.
Well, I just want to state for the record, because you seemed reluctant to go there, that you inherited a bankrupt organization.
Yeah.
And you spent much of your time in the presidency figuring out ways to bail the organization out. And I appreciate your demurring on that fact, but I think for the generations that have followed you and the kind of financial structure CBDNA currently enjoys, it's really important that everyone understands your yeoman efforts in keeping CBDNA alive, not in the way that Mark Hinesley feared, but in the way that allowed it to function and grow because of other changes you made.
The day my term started, which was at the end of the conference in '75, we had a new secretary treasurer, Bob Briggs from Berkeley, University of California, because I wanted somebody that I could communicate with closely on the West Coast. The first thing he did was come up and say, "We have no money in the bank." And here we had this big bill from the expensive hotel where we had just stayed, you know. And I was pretty shocked. It was incredible. Just 2 years before, the National Jazz Association, which was 3 times the size of CBDNA, had the same problem. They went broke and they disappeared. The organization just disappeared. So the first thing I did was, with Bob Briggs having been a popular figure in the San Francisco area for a number of years, he was able to use his personal contacts to delay the debt we had for the conference until such time as we could repay the motel and all these people. And that was very, if it weren't for that, we might have disappeared like the National Jazz Group. So I set about thinking, how are we going to overcome being bankrupt? And the first thing was, it's hard to imagine for me today, but there was a tradition that everybody always wanted to go to the Midwest Conference every year. And there was a tradition that the next board meeting for CBDNA would be in Chicago at the time of the Midwest Conference. And there had been a tradition that the CBDNA board of directors paid not only the airfare for everybody on the board, but also the hotel. And you can imagine the board was like, I don't know, 15 members or something. That was a big chunk of money right there. I mean, for myself alone, the airfare was $1,000, you know, from California. So I wrote to the board and I said, you know, I wish we could have this meeting in December, but the only topic that we really have to talk about is the fact that we're bankrupt. So I said, I think I have no choice but to end this tradition of paying everybody's way to go there in their hotels. And I said, however, I've reserved a room in the Hilton for a meeting and I'll be there. And if enough of you show up and we have a quorum, we'll go ahead and have our board meeting, but we just can't pay for everybody. And of course, everybody showed up, you know. And then the next thing that was kind of surprising to me was there had been a tradition for the national conference. Every 2 years, they published a book of proceedings, a published book of all the speeches, all the programs, a pretty thick book. And that, of course, was a substantial expense. And so I ended that, and it's never returned. But there was a history of the division doing the same thing. There were published books of North Central Division Book of Proceedings for their divisional conferences. And I think 75% of these things were lost over the years, but the ones that the previous Secretary of Treasury had collected a dozen or so of these books. And I went through them all just partly to see what you're supposed to do, you know, as an incoming president. And there were some really wonderful, wonderful speeches and insights. I remember there was a North Central meeting, it must have been in the 1950s, when Alfred Reed was working still for a New York publisher. And I don't remember, it was a big name publisher, but I don't remember which one it was.
I think it was Baldwin Mills.
Pardon?
I think it was Baldwin Mills.
Maybe so, I don't know. But he gave a speech where he described his job there. He was the only person in the executive level who dealt with band music. Everybody else, all the other editors and proofreaders and so forth, dealt with orchestra music, instrumental music, choral music. And when something came in for band, if somebody sent a band score, they wanted to see if it could be published, they sent it to Alfred Reed in his office. And they called his office the rat hole. So it's send this piece to the rat hole. And it was Reed's job to make a decision to publish or not publish and so forth. The picture of that carries a lot of weight in my mind of the up until the 50s of the way bands fit into the artistic level of the United States. So I had to get rid of that. And then we had it had been a tradition, started, I don't know how early it started, but to get some good composer to write a new piece to be premiered at the conference. And later on, Copeland wrote a piece for one of our conferences. So I had become friendly with Ernst Krenek in Southern California. who was a very big name in Europe. And I asked him to, if he would write a piece for us, and he agreed to do it. And he wanted to know what instrumentation should I use. And I put Bob Reynolds in charge of this subcommittee. And Bob, trying to be helpful, just sent him a list of all the available instruments, including 5 contra saxes, and Krennic used some of them. So we wrote a piece for multiple Barry saxes. And I remember Bob, when Bob went down to meet with him, Bob took a bunch of took some scores for Krennic to look at, see what kind of pieces people had written for band, good pieces. And Bob took some recordings, which surprised Krennic, and he said, well, no, thank you, I can read the scores. And Bob was kind of embarrassed by that. But it was a natural thing that any of us might have done, you know.
Sure.
So anyway, he wrote a piece, and then, having been bankrupt for nearly all of my term, I didn't have the money to pay Krennic, and it was only like $300 at that time.
It's absolutely stunning
Yeah.
to realize that he wrote that piece, Dream Sequence, for only $300. Even in 1977, someone of his reputation and stature worldwide at that point, that when you mentioned that figure to me earlier, I was just flabbergasted when major composers these days are asking $3,000 a minute.
That's right. Well, you know, this is almost 50 years ago, and that was, I think, probably commission works were fairly rare at that point, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was I think that probably was a figure that he suggested. And so I called up Bob Reynolds. I said, you're chairman of this committee. I don't have the money to pay him. So Bob loaned the CBDNA $300 that we paid Krennic. And then a year later, I was able to pay Bob back. So it was when I say bankrupt, it was a very daily part of decision making. And by the time my 2 years were over, and I was followed by Frank Battisti, I was able to give him actual money in a bank account. And since then, I think the group has been on its own 2 feet. Another thing I did to raise money, of course, was to try to expand membership, because I don't remember what membership cost at that time. It may have only been $40 or something, but that was free money, so to speak, for getting out of bankruptcy. Again, there was no particular cost. So I organized about 20 task forces, and every task force had 6 members and a chairman. And I in every case, I would take 3 current members to be on that committee, that task force, and then I would pick 3 people who were not members, 3 people who had prominent university jobs but were not members, and I put them on. So altogether, I had about 60 non-members participating. And of course, that really brought them into the fold. They had to join just to accept. And it brought a lot of fresh blood into the organization. And the task forces were mostly rather practical in nature and not musical. There was one to see if we should get into the job of helping with job placement. At that time, there was no Google, you know. And there was one that focused on ethics. There was one that focused on, should we be involved in helping universities with peer evaluation? Another one dealt with grading. How do we justify grading for a wind band? There was one that was just assemble European contacts, names and addresses, and several on repertoire. One dealt with small group repertoire, another with repertoire with a soloist, another with transcriptions, and there were several that dealt with education. What should be the relationship between the university band director and K through 6, for example? Is there anything that we should be doing to help them and so on? So there were a lot of useful topics. I mean, it's about everything I could think of. But the basic idea from my perspective was to re-energize, bring new people in, and also to use their money to help us get out of debt. And I also have to say, all of this was before the age of computers. So when I was writing members to join these task forces, it meant I had to pay a lady to basically type the same letter 100 times. And that sort of thing was really more difficult before we all had computers.
Yeah, email and the internet and even Google and Zoom that we're doing today have changed the world dramatically.
That's right. Yeah.
But you know what's interesting to consider in the conversation is that CBDNA may have been founded in the 40s, but it feels like the modern version of CBDNA was invented in the mid-70s by you and the generation of people that followed, because many of the things that you're outlining as transformative in the get out of debt scheme and the transition from director to conductor, more focus on music and organization, have been the hallmark of my experience in CBDNA. And my first CBDNA was the 1977 conference in Maryland. I was a graduate student in the Baylor Wind Ensemble, which did not have to change its name. And I played the second tenor saxophone part under Ernst Krenek is when he conducted the dream sequence. So there's a lot of connections here across the many years that I think, in addition to all the things that you've published and written and advised on, we have to be very grateful for you.
To make one further comment about your question, I think in general, before my term, CBDNA was just more of a kind of social thing, you know. You get, especially when it was the one day tacked onto the end of the Midwest, a little like the ABA, American Bandmasters Association. They don't really have a purpose to exist other than just a nice social one. I mean, they don't really do anything, I don't think, or at least up to the point when I was a member, they never did anything. So it was just a nice, and there's a place for that. There's a place to go see your colleagues and, you know, but then the period you're talking about with the younger presidents, that's when it started to become more of a professional organization and with trying to help each other. I still think there's more work that needs to be done in helping become a better conductor. I've always felt there was a little bit of intimidation about maybe we shouldn't interfere. This is an individual has his own style, and we shouldn't have a clinic that tells him how to conduct or even how to improve. There has never been much on that level, and particularly with teaching memorization, which is something that was always very important to me. That's something that they could do in a clinic of some kind that would be very helpful to some people. And I still think there's a little bit left still to be done about the distinction between aesthetic music and entertainment music. Entertainment music is almost in the blood of band directors because of its history, you know. And even with Sousa makes it very clear in his own autobiography that he was playing Wagner and, you know, for the purpose of entertainment and not as something to lift the cultural instincts of the listeners, you know. So that entertainment part is just almost in the blood. I mean, I've seen college conductors come out on the stage wearing a clown suit. There was a Big Ten university director who played Rimsky-Korsakov's Flight of the Bumblebee, and the conductor was running around the stage with a fly swatter. I mean, that was just part of what a band concert was. A big part of it was entertainment, you know.
I think
I,
hopefully those are the exceptions rather than the rules.
there's still some of that blood that needs to be filtered out.
Yeah. I also should give our current ABA colleagues credit where credit is due. They have, in my experience, developed a portfolio distinctly from CBDNA, but also with purpose to enhance the quality of music and music education.
Well,
It may be different than your experience. So I think just for the historical record, we should give them that.
I'm glad to hear they're thinking along those lines. Yeah.
So before we close, is there anything that you would like to comment on that we haven't addressed directly, or any advice that you would like to give that we haven't given you?
I'd like to say a word about my concert, my convention in Maryland that you attended. I mentioned that it was the first time anybody was allowed to appear that wasn't called a band. It was also another thing I insisted on, and this might be controversial, but when I invited somebody to perform there, I informed that I intended to have a veto role on the repertoire of the concert they played at the National Convention. And I made it clear I didn't want entertainment pieces, and I wanted them to represent the finest kind of repertoire that they normally played with their band. I think it was certainly the first time anybody played that role, and no one had any objection to that. You know, I just here's the time, here's the day, and here's what we expect. You know, but that was very important to me. I didn't want a group to come and I didn't want the Eastman Wind Ensemble to come and play early American drums and piccolo or something. You know.
Well, they did much better than that. I remember the effect in the room when the Schwantner Mountains Rising Nowhere was premiered on that conference.
Yeah. Well, it's a good example. I mean, that's a wonderful purpose to introduce a piece like that to a whole bunch of conductors. You know. By the way, I got in trouble one time. Now that passes my mind. I think it was a CBDNA conference in the West Coast, maybe in Los Angeles. And on the program was the last movement of David Maslanka's Second Symphony. Premiere, I believe, just the last movement. And I thought it was terrific. And I ran up to him and said, I want to play this whole symphony. How do I get the parts? What do I do? And he told me, I'll send you the parts. And I think he charged $300. So he sent me the parts and I started rehearsing, and I rehearsed several weeks. And that particular symphony has a really difficult first movement. And my purpose was, we were also invited to perform for the National MENC Conference, which was going to be held in, I don't know, New Orleans maybe, and or Houston or someplace. And I wanted to present this Maslanka Symphony in a concert before the MENC, because no one on the West Coast at that time knew his name. And so I started rehearsing, and then I got an angry phone call from John Painter. He said, you should know that piece was commissioned by the Big Ten band directors and has never been performed. It's never had, they're entitled to the first performance. And he was very, very critical. And I said, well, I asked the composer, can I play it? And I said, I had no way of knowing that there was a restriction like that involved. And he was really very angry. And so he said, well, I know you're going to do it anyway, so just go ahead and do it. And I said, no, I'm not going to do it. I said, I might ask the Big Ten band directors for permission to do it or something. And I wrote to them all and said, I've already started rehearsing this for 3 weeks, and I won't call it a premiere. Whenever you guys, they had never played. It was too hard for some of the Big Ten bands to play. I said, whenever you play it, you can call it the premiere. And I just want to introduce this guy to the West Coast. But so they took a ballot, and I lost the ballot, I don't know, 8-2 or something like that. And so I gathered the material, sent it back. And then Maslanka wrote a very nice apology to the Big Ten band directors, taking the blame that it was really his fault and not my fault. And it was unfair that they were criticizing me for this. And then a couple of years later, Painter was on the committee for ASCAP. That they meet once a year to divide up the few crumbs that ASCAP leaves for classical music. So for a year, at that time they paid 3 or 4 times a year. At that time, I suddenly got thousands of dollars, a couple $1,000 each time, which I took to be Painter's form of apology to pay me back for the anguish that it had caused. So let's see, I guess that's, well, there was the other thing I want to mention was my ethics discussion. At Maryland, one of the business meetings, I advertised in advance that we're going to talk about the ethics of the profession. Should we have published principles of ethics? I mean, medical doctors have such a document, dentists have such a document. And so the room, everybody was there, and I said, okay, well, I'm just going to mention some circumstances and see what you guys think about this. I said, suppose you're organizing a European tour for high school bands in the summer. Is it ethical for you to take money from every student for yourself without telling anybody, without telling the student that some of the money is going to you? Should that be considered ethical? Not a word. No one said a word, and they were all doing this, they were all organizing things. And I gave 5 or 6 examples, and none of them was anybody willing to publicly say, I think this is wrong, or I think this should be okay. And much less ever getting to a committee to write such a document. It was, I told somebody that was like, if a visitor opened the door, they would think maybe it was a prayer service or something. It was so quiet. And but I thought that, I still think that's important. I think there should be, in any profession, there should be some kind of outer limits of what the profession itself considers ethical, and I'm not sure it will ever happen. I got a stinging rebuke from Bill Ravelli privately. He said, what gives you the right to interfere in my personal commerce? And that was probably the view everybody had, but I felt if you had a set of principles and then someone wanted to organize something, you'd have something to feel ethical about, And but that was a session that really went nowhere. That's all I remember in particular.
As with that subject and many of the other things we discussed today, you were blazing a trail that has been to the benefit of us all. David, we are all indebted to you for your time today, but more importantly, for your so many years of service and thoughtful reflection, as well as leadership. And we certainly wish you the best. And I know that the generations of people who may watch this video in the days ahead will be greatly informed and enlightened by your comments today.
Well,
so thank you on behalf of CBDNA, and it's been a real personal privilege to share this time with you.
My pleasure.